You're listening to the Faith and Other Oddities podcast, brought to you by the Raven Creek Social Club, where we talk about faith and other oddities. For questions, comments, or to be part of the conversation, join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where you can find us at Raven Creek SC. Now for your hosts, Emily Dixon and Nathan Underwood.
Hey everyone, welcome to Faith and Other Oddities. Today we're in Judges. We're actually going to get into the text, and we started kind of introducing it last week with some resources and some materials to try and help everyone out. But we're actually going to take a look at the book of Judges and see what we've got.
Yeah.
So it's a crazy book. It's got is it the most dismemberment in the Bible, or
I think so.
Or the most, at least the most detailed accounts of it.
Yeah, well, and it's just back to back once we get past the introduction.
Yeah.
Once you get past the introduction, then it's just violence. I mean, It's just straight up. This is the action adventure chapter of the Bible. And
right.
It's even though there's wars and conquest, every place else they're kind of discussed in broad strokes. And we're talking about what the tribes did. And with Judges, we're more talking about what the individual is doing.
Right.
And except for the first couple of chapters, which that's all introduction stuff. And it really is setting the scene. And
yeah,
this.
But even though it's introductory, though, there's still there's a decent amount of action and quite a bit of good detail there.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, yeah. Okay. Well, and let's kind of get into that because we actually, one of our first stories is about the king who has his thumbs and toes cut off. And this is the only place in the Bible that we're going to find that kind of graphic torture of a prisoner of war.
Mm-hmm.
Every place else, if there's anything like Joshua displaying the bodies of the dead kings in his book, it's the bodies after the death.
Right.
With Judges, we actually have the people of God doing things that are not characteristic of the people of God. Mm-hmm. And that's what the setup with all this introductory material is about, is to explain to you that, hey, in the book of Joshua, they were following God's commands. They were doing it right. There was actually a more humane treatment, even though we do have, these massive wars. Mm-hmm. The code of conduct was so much more elevated than what you're going to see in Judges. And even the judges themselves, their actions are questionable.
Right.
And there's a lot of critique against the judges themselves, with only two big exceptions. And we'll get to those. But
yeah. So yeah, there's a lot of dismemberment, and you're talking about, this is the only part where we see there's torture of a prisoner of war who's still alive. And so that's the way this is presented. This book gets a lot of critique from non-Christians because...
And ignored by Christians.
And yeah, exactly. Ignored by Christians because there is so much going on that everyone goes, well, how could God approve of that stuff? And I think we're going to see, we go back through this, it's not approved.
Right.
But we're going to pick up on our favorite theme in the Bible? Redemption. How God comes through and redeems situations to teach us a lesson. And when I say he redeems these stories, I'm not saying they all wind up rosy pink and everything's fine.
Right.
But, it's a story that we can learn from.
And it displays God's compassion, because one of the things that you're going to notice, there's this ongoing cycle that becomes very evident. Basically, the people are doing evil in the sight of God. Mm-hmm. And as they're doing evil in the sight of God, they cry out. And that word there is not repent. They're not crying out in repentance. They're crying out in misery and anguish. Mm-hmm. They aren't saying, hey, God, we messed up. Can you come save us because we want to be yours? They're just saying, we need help.
Yeah.
And God moves with compassion, even on these unrepentant people. And then there's this cycle of peace. And then the judge of that particular story dies. And then the people start to do evil in the sight of the Lord again. Mm-hmm. They cry out. God raises up a judge. We go through this over and over again. And each time God is saying, even though you've messed up and even though you are not doing what you're supposed to and you aren't even repenting, I love you and I'm still going to move on your behalf. Mm-hmm. And, that's good news. We need to know that even when we totally mess it up, God still loves us and he moves on the behalf of the hurting.
Yeah. And well, let's start, just kind of walk us through chapter 1 and And let's talk about like how we get from the time of Joshua into the time of Judges.
Okay, so as we get into this, you got to remember this author is very brilliant. I mean, he's doing something amazing. He is pointing us back to Joshua, and we're going to have a lot of the same language, a lot of the same words and phrases that we find in Joshua. We're going to have some of the stories that were told in Joshua retold. And a lot of times they're told with a little difference. It's not because they're contradictions. I get so tired of the contradictions argument.
Right.
The writer is putting a different emphasis on what's happening. So the different writers bring out different things. But at the same time, while he's telling us to look backwards, he's also telling us to look forward. There's a lot of foreshadowing in what's going to happen, not just within the book of Judges, but also in the book of Samuel. And if you'll remember from the last episode, there's the tradition that Samuel wrote both Judges and the book of Samuel it together.
Right.
And so now I don't agree with that. I think that's completely, there's no reason really to believe that other than tradition.
Sure.
But at the same time, that's how they were seen. So that tells you that the books are connected.
Mm-hmm.
And so the tradition, even though I think it's wrong, it does inform us on how to read it.
Okay. Now, do we think that the author of Judges also authored Joshua, or do you think that the author took the format?
Right. That's what we're looking at.
Okay.
That's exactly what he did. As a matter of fact, he begins. Joshua 1 says, "And after the death of Moses." Judges opens up with the exact same phrase, "after the death of Joshua." So definitely, somebody whoever wrote Judges had a copy of Joshua sitting right there next to him, and they were playing off each other. And in doing so, this is how he pulls us back and allows us to compare and contrast the days of Joshua with the days of Judges. In Joshua, you've got this strong leader, you've got somebody that people respect, you have someone that the people can look up to, and Joshua's on the battlefield with God.
Right.
And the angel of the Lord is there consulting with Joshua 5, whenever the commander of the Lord's host shows up and says, I'm going to be with you.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is the theme of Joshua is, what do the people accomplish under strong leadership? Judges is, what are people messing up in the absence of strong leadership?
Okay.
So
they kind of mirror each other quite a bit.
Yes. And when you compare and contrast, it really comes out. So chapter 1 is set up with a very specific formula. It's from the Assyrian summation text. We have archaeological records of these, and this is something that was used in the Middle East that basically recounts the conquering of a nation. They are not chronological accounts. So just like the Assyrian summation text, this is not a chronological account. This is a geographic account. So you're actually watching the progression of how they take the land, from one side of the border to the other. So we aren't worried about date and time here. We're just worried about content.
Okay.
So we can keep that in mind. It's also not a complete list of the tribes. Not all the tribes are mentioned, which makes sense because if we're operating geographically, Reuben and Dan settled on the other side of the Jordan. Mm-hmm. Now they're going into Canaan. Levi is not included because they don't get an allotment. They have cities within the various tribes to serve as spiritual leaders. Issachar was probably an oversight, honestly. There's a huge emphasis on Judah specifically, which is kind of interesting because Judah doesn't have any real standing at this point. He is not the leading tribe. The only thing he's really got going for him is that blessing back in Genesis 49 that we talked about, and the scepter shall not depart from him. Right. And so, and we aren't going to see that prophecy fulfilled until King David. Right. So we've still got a few hundred years here. Now, the emphasis on Judah can also indicate that this was somebody who was written by somebody who was personally involved with the battle. Mm-hmm. That they, at least this chapter, it was probably based on eyewitness accounts. And this would make it one of the oldest chapters in the Bible, possibly even predating the Song of Deborah. Okay. And Deborah, we know for a fact, was written at least by the 11th century, making it one of the oldest parts of the Bible. So, and we've got some really interesting things to say about that when we get to Deborah. But, so we got memories. We got eyewitness accounts. We have exact wordings from judges. So this also tells us the editor.
You mean from Joshua?
Yes, from Joshua.
Sorry.
So yeah, so very much evidence this was an editor who put this together for a purpose. This document was written to be a prophetic book, and we need to remember that, because if we don't remember it's a prophetic book, then we don't get the theological message. We just get caught up in the gore and the violence and all the action.
Okay, so this book, you're saying it even though it's an account of what's going on. Okay, so what sets off a prophetic book necessarily? I mean, and this is something that probably is really basic, or we think it should be. So what sets off a prophetic book from the rest of? I mean, other than there is some kind of message from God, but of course the whole Bible is a message from God. So,
right, a prophetic book usually includes a warning. It's basically saying, if you do this, then God's going to do that. And when you boil this book down, it boils down to, if you're going to act like you don't have a king, like they did in Judges, then you're not going to have a king. Because if this was written in the time of Manasseh, now we're looking at the Babylonian exile, and when the tribes were taken out of Israel and weren't returned again, and some of them never to be returned again. And so the book function is, if you're going to rise to this level of violence, even though you have a king, then you won't have a king. You won't even have a nation.
Okay.
And so they're kind of reverting back to the state of Judges by the time we get to Manasseh, that the violence was increasing in the nation. There's no care for the widows and orphans. There's the true religion is gone.
Okay.
And so this book serves as kind of a parable, almost would be a way to think of it. That if God's going to act this way in the past, then he's still capable of doing it today.
Okay, that makes sense.
Now we begin the chapter, we begin the book actually on a very positive note. And it says in verse 1, after the death of Joshua, the people of Israel inquired of the Lord. This is good.
Right.
This is actually a pretty awesome thing. And you've got to remember that they had just been with Joshua, who was a leader, who had God with them. And God was fighting on behalf of them. Matter of fact, in the battles of Joshua, God goes before them and kills the enemies. And when you read the conversations that Joshua has with God, they don't sound like prayers.
Right.
They sound like he's talking to someone who's right there next to him.
Sure.
And I think when we take off our bias of God being this abstraction in the Old Testament, this power that's floating out there, and actually go back and read the accounts as if the angel of the Lord was there in the midst. And we've talked before about how the angel of the Lord's embodied God. And this kind of relationship, it really feels like this is not a time of abstract spirituality.
Right. And which is really funny, because you probably heard this in Sunday school growing up. I know I certainly did. Was that when Jesus came around, and he was the first one to really make people think of God as someone you could relate to. And you see if you're actually looking at Genesis, at Joshua, at Exodus, these books, they don't paint God that way.
Oh, no.
I mean, you have this idea that, well, Jesus came along and said and called God Father, and no one ever did that before. And that's just not true. And the idea of God as this odd spiritual abstraction comes more from, Eastern thought than anything.
Neoplatonism.
Or Greek thought. But
yeah.
But this, so for the Jewish mindset, it wasn't totally outlandish to have God as a person.
100%. God was very much present. I mean, we open Genesis with God walking in the garden.
Right.
And so the idea that God could actually be present, that was part of their culture.
Well, and that's interesting to me now. That I hadn't really thought of the walking in the garden thing, but, listening to Heiser talk about the two powers theology, about there's God who is in heaven reigning, and then there is like the angel of the Lord character who can be physically present. And I always heard growing up, God walking in the garden, oh, well, that's just That's just
it's a metaphor.
I'm trying to think of metaphor. There's another word that I heard. Symbolic is what we always heard. And he didn't actually walk because God's just a spirit and doesn't have feet.
Mm-hmm.
But then we contradict ourselves when we get into the stories of Abraham and we talk about the angel of the Lord who was God.
Yeah.
And so I do find it very...
When God arrives to eat a meal with Abraham?
Yeah, so it's very strange to me that that would be... Again, it's those arbitrary lines that we talk about where...
It's our filter.
We're willing to believe this, but not this. And so, yeah, that does make sense that, yeah, God would actually physically walk with people.
Oh, well, it says in Joshua 1:5, God tells Joshua, I will be with you as I was with Moses. How was God with Moses? And, they were on Sinai. They were talking. They were having a conversation. This is where we get the Torah from, the 10 Commandments. And so Joshua was not, sending these random prayers up in helium balloons to heaven and hoping God would respond. He's like having these real on the fly kind of conversations in the heat of battle with God.
Now it's been a while since I've read through Joshua. I should have done it because I know we're judges and the parallels and everything. But did Joshua, did he go into the tent of meeting to meet with God? I don't recall if that's in the narrative or not.
I don't remember right off. I know he was outside a lot of times when Moses was inside, and I want to say he didn't. I know Joshua 5, he's outside of Jericho and the commander of the Lord's host shows up. And, that's a point-by-point replay of the burning bush.
Right.
And you can just follow it. And it makes sense, too, just while we're on the topic. When Moses is up on the mountain as a shepherd, that God would appear to Moses in a burning bush, something that a shepherd would understand. And here is Joshua, who's this fierce general. God shows up to him like that. And so it's, I think from what we've seen, there is definitely this God responding and appearing to people in methods and ways that they identify with and that they see themselves in. And so I don't know. I'd have this long way to answer your question, but that's kind of...
Okay. Well, maybe we can go back and look at that later.
Yeah. So... get through. See, this is where I get lost in my notes because
then I mess you up. We start talking about something that's supposed to happen later.
Well, or something that happened in the past. But Joshua 1 and Joshua 23 are speaking to the people, and he's telling the people to do exactly what they're doing, that they're supposed to follow in his footsteps. They're supposed to inquire of the Lord. Now, Webb says that this requires a definite interaction with God, because the instructions are too complex to just be the Urim and Thummim. I always say that wrong, don't I?
Urim and the Thummim.
Yeah. That it's not a yes or no, that it's... I totally didn't see what you just showed me.
Sorry. But yeah. So, okay. So the speculation, there's speculation that instead of inquiring to God, that they are... instead of going and talking to him like Joshua did, that they're having to use the Urim and the Thummim. And that's a traditional speculation on the Jewish teacher's part.
Yes, because, from that perspective, when you bring in the Jewish perspective, now this is a sad thing that the people are having to inquire of the Lord. Yeah. Because they didn't need this before because they had Joshua interpreting. Right. And where Christian writers look at it and say, this is great. They're actually doing what they're supposed to do. And,
because in our tradition, you inquire of the Lord. Well, what do you do before you make any decision? Well, you pray. And that's what we think of when we think of inquiring of the Lord, is that we're going to pray. Yeah. And so
that doesn't, and that's where this doesn't fit even our ideas.
Right. Well, and it's very interesting to me that how quickly the Bible gives these very specific answers. And of course, how quickly did it happen? Do we even know? Right. Because again, the narrative's not complete, but we see David doing this, and when he's trapped and he says he's going to inquire of the Lord, and and he's he asks God, are these people going to deliver me into my enemy's hands? And God says, yes, they're going to deliver you into your enemy's hands. And so it's very I'm very curious about how things happened,
Right.
and especially we see this again, speed and detail, or
Mhm.
seeming amount of speed and detail. Again, the narrative is it's unclear. So
Well, and and I'm sure that was one of the things that the writers had to take in consideration. How much detail do we include? Because, even what they included is sometimes overwhelming. So, but the Jews were very much, they felt like this was sad. And they felt like that they would have consulted with the priest in the Urim and Thummim, and they would may have been getting these yes or no kind of answers from the casting, kind of like casting lots.
Yeah.
And Webb says no, that this is too detailed, and we've got way too many words. And I tend to lean towards Webb. So this is one of those times that you're going to see me side with the Christian commentators and their interpretations of things on this, because the instructions do, especially as we go through, get very specific. And by the time we get to chapter 3, I think there's even more evidence to back up that this was at least an audible interaction that occurred. How far it went beyond that, I have no idea. But the answer is that Judah shall go up. And so Judah's the first one singled out. Again, geographic, not chronological. He's going to go up, and he is going to conquer. And this is going to foreshadow, that David is going to rise up and be a conqueror, and that Jesus is going to come from the line of David. Judah invites Simon to join him in the battle, and this makes sense. They're biological brothers.
Well, their predecessors were.
Yeah, exactly, and we should clarify that.
Yeah, because we're not, even though we're using the names of the individuals, that's referring to the tribes as though the tribe were a person,
right?
Which is kind of weird. But
and that's throughout the book. So anytime you hear of the original 12 patriarchs, we're actually referring to the tribe. We're talking about their descendants. We aren't talking about the individual themselves.
Right, because they didn't live all the way through the Egyptian captivity and all that stuff.
They aren't 500-600 years old? Not
the last time I checked, so.
We're out of Genesis. So, yeah. But the tribes were kind of connected based on the connections that were among the 12 brothers. So Judah and Simon were biological brothers, full brothers, sons of Leah. And Simon, the tribe, very much followed in the pattern of Simon the person. Simon was the one who, if you'll remember, Simon and Levi attacked Shechem. And so they were kind of known for being very fierce. And also the reason why Reuben asked Simon to join them is Simon's inheritance was within Judah's territory. So they kind of...
You mean why Judah asked Simon to join him?
Yeah.
You said Reuben.
I don't know why I said Reuben.
But okay, so Judah brings...
Maybe I'm hungry.
Maybe.
So, yeah. Reuben's greatest accomplishment, that sandwich. Anyway. But no. So,
sorry, I didn't mean to derail you. I'm like, I just want to make sure we're clear on that. So
Judah,
Simon's land is within Judah's territory.
Right.
And so...
And so it makes sense. I mean, they're going to be fighting for basically the same landmass.
Right.
And it's logical, it's rational. And what winds up happening actually is Judah will absorb Simon. And you aren't going to hear anything more about Simon after, I think it's verse 17 of this book. And then in 200 years, you really don't hear Simon spoken about as an independent tribe at all. They're just kind of, an aspect of Judah. So they are going to be fighting the Canaanites and the Perizzites. And they do defeat them.
Yeah.
This is the first time that the Perizzites are mentioned in Judges, and they're a distinct group within the Canaanites. The first time we heard about them was Genesis 15. And that's when God gives Abraham the promise that he's going to displace this whole list of nations. The Perizzites is on that list. And so that's the first time we hear about it. And now this prophecy from all these hundreds of years ago, it's coming true.
Right.
And over and over again, whenever you find throughout Exodus and Deuteronomy, And in Joshua, when God's promising the victory of Israel over these Canaanite nations, the Perizzites are always included in that list. They were one of the groups of people, just a little side note, that Jacob was afraid of when Simon and Levi attack Shechem.
Yeah.
It was one of the groups of people Jacob specifically mentions and says, they're going to attack us. They're going to kill us because of what you did.
Right.
So these were pretty fierce folks. And Joshua 17:15 says, clean the ground for yourselves in the land of the Perizzites and the Rephaim. That's important because the Perizzites are always mentioned in connection. Well, I say almost always mentioned in connection with the Rephaim.
Right.
And we spent a lot of time talking about the Rephaim. These were the giants.
Mhm.
These are descendants of the Nephilim. And they are a group of people that were specifically put under harem, which is that the utter destruction.
Okay.
So they're supposed to be completely wiped out. There's not supposed to be any mercy because they are the spiritual and biological hybrids. That's the corruption of God's established order.
Right.
So, and
Okay.
and a real quick word on that, because people get really uncomfortable when we start talking about genocide.
Right.
And a couple of things to remember there. Whenever we have individuals who repent and turn to God anywhere in the scripture, even during these times of utter destruction, they're accepted.
Right. Yeah.
And
We see that with Rahab and who else?
Ruth.
Ruth. Yeah.
We see it with Caleb, and we're going to be
Mhm.
talking about that. And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law.
Mhm.
So this is not just indiscriminate killing. These are people who they knew the truth
Right.
because they've got connections back to Esau and Ishmael, and these individuals we know actually did know the stories. So they knew that this was God's land.
Mhm.
They knew that this was the land that had been promised to the Israelites. So this is basically, they're coming home and finding burglars in their house and saying, you need to leave.
Well, yeah. Well, there's that. There's people taking over the land that God's promised to Israel, but you also have, like you said, there are people who knew the truth and made a choice.
Mm-hmm.
They are choosing to go directly into the into the camp of God's enemies and decide that that's where they want to be.
Precisely.
So it's not just like, what? Hey guys, what's going on? Oh,
Well,
there's a sword there. You're going to kill me with it? It wasn't like just they showed up. It was like they made a choice.
Well, Rahab says that. Rahab specifically notes that when the children of Israel get to Jericho, the nations have heard. They're afraid of this God. And so she lays it out. This is why I'm going to be on your side. This is why I'm helping you, because I know your God's the true God. And so she lets us know that these people are not ignorant.
Mm-hmm.
And she didn't learn this because she was somebody special. She learned this because she was in a city where this was all the buzz.
Right.
So the other reason why these people had to be driven out, you've got to remember, this is a time of collective blessing and cursing. And blessing at this point meant rain. It meant abundant harvest. It meant, flocks that were healthy.
Right.
God can't bless his people without blessing his enemies if the enemies are living in the middle of his people's home.
Right.
So this is God saying, hey, I'm going to protect your blessing for you. So this is, we're getting into verse 5 here because this is
covered a lot of ground.
We've covered a lot of ground. Yeah. So getting into verse 5, we have Judah has fought this battle. They've won. God gave them the victory.
Mm-hmm.
Verse 5 says, and they found Adoni-Bezek at Bezek and fought against him and defeated the Canaanites and the Perizzites. And Adoni-Bezek fled, but they pursued and caught him and cut off his thumbs and his big toes. So this is that story we were talking about is a little different. We've got
someone being tortured.
And
go ahead.
Go ahead.
And specifically, we have how they're tortured, which is seems just totally bizarre to me.
It's really weird. Now, we do know that cutting off thumbs and toes was something that did occur specifically to inhibit prisoners of war from engaging in warfare.
Right.
And now I was looking specifically for some kind of historical account that gave even more detail about why they would have done this to this king. I really couldn't find anything other than everyone knows that this happened. And I'm like, I kind of hate those sorts of
right.
If everyone knows something, where did they learn it?
Yeah.
And so we do know that it happened here. I know that I think I can remember reading about it happening in other ancient cultures, but I can't find the specific source on it. But what's interesting about this, if we just go with what the Bible says, is there's the speech. This is the very interesting part. The speech that Adoni Bezek says, 70 kings and their thumbs and their big toes cut off used to pick up scraps under my table. As I have done, God has repaid me. And they brought him to Jerusalem and he died there. So this guy was doing this to his prisoners of war. And he's thinking theologically about this. Even though he's a Canaanite, he's thinking theologically about it. And he's saying, this was done to me because God, and then the thing is, the word here, God, is Elohim. Elohim can be a specific name of God. It can be a generic, just like our word for God.
Yeah.
It can be any God. So which God is he talking about?
Yeah. Or he could have just been referring to, this is my fate. The fates have seen my destruction, as it were.
Yeah, and he accepts it because in his worldview, the idea that gods would repay you for what you did, that was just normal. And so he acknowledges this. The problem with this is not in keeping with God's way of dealing with people. And so the tribe has already adopted Canaanite methodology.
Oh, you're saying what Judah and them did, not the retribution part, because we do see,
right.
I was like, no, we do see God repaying things.
We do.
But yeah, you're talking specifically about the torture of life captives.
Yeah, I mean, just in this short period of time, we don't know how long it was, but they had already said, hey, this is how the Canaanites do it. This is what we're going to do. And this is a problem. And we can't have Canaanite methodology being used to accomplish God's goals. And then we have the additional problem. They take him to Jerusalem. What are they doing with him? We don't have prisoners of war. We don't keep kings of conquered nations.
Right.
We specifically see this in 1 Samuel 15, where, I'm sorry, is that, yes, 1 Samuel 15, when Saul captures Agag. Samuel is so mad that Saul does this, he hacks him to pieces.
Right.
And so you don't do this. And this is the beginning of the end.
Yeah.
Because everything from here on out is going to start to decline. And not only do they torture this guy, they keep him as a prisoner of war. He goes to Jerusalem. How long was he in Jerusalem? Did they kill him when they got to Jerusalem? Did he die of old age? What's going on here? We don't know. Right. And if we had answers to those questions, we would have...
Or did God kill him as an act of mercy to stop the Israelites from doing more evil?
Yeah.
Where is it? Yeah.
Now, Malbin, who was a Polish rabbi, he lived in about 1800 to 1870. He argued that this guy was spared because he confessed his sins and accepted his consequence. So he actually sees what Bezek is saying as positive.
I can see how you might get there, but it might be a little bit of a stretch.
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree with that. But
to me, it sounds more like self-pity.
And I thought it sounded stoic.
Yeah, I can see that.
But I didn't see it as repentance. But I was kind of like, okay, this is the way it goes. To take him back to Jerusalem was kind of a big deal too, because Jerusalem, that's going to be the centerpiece of all of our theology. And Jerusalem, we do know that it was an inhabited city at this point. And we have in the Egyptian text at this point it's the name for the city is the establishment of God.
Okay.
So it was already associated with a holy place, that there was some sacred significance. And of course, this is also the city that Melchizedek, he's the king of Salem, which is also the same. It's the same
Jerusalem.
place.
Yeah.
So now Judah does burn the inhabitants and the whole city, and doesn't burn the inhabitants. He burns the whole city. He does kill all the inhabitants like he's supposed to, with the exception of this king. And that's where the question comes in, because if he's killing everybody else there, is this the point in time that he killed the king?
Right.
Who knows? And so we're seeing that things are happening kind of like they're supposed to, but not like they're supposed to. There's kind of this lukewarm approach to what God's commanding. So, but then we go into verses 8 through 10. And do you want to read that?
Oh, no, go ahead.
Okay. The minute, well, actually,
is it 8?
I'm looking. The men of Judah fought against Jerusalem, captured it, and struck it with the edge of the sword, and set fire to the city. Then after the men of Judah went down to fight against the Canaanites who lived in the hill country, in the Negev, in the lowland, then Judah went against the Canaanites who lived in Hebron. Now the name of Hebron was formerly Kiriath Arba, and they defeated Sheshai and Ahai and Talmai. Okay, this is where I was going. Yes, it's nice to remember I do have a plan.
Yeah.
So
well, you got all those notes there. I figured you were doing something.
Just a little bit. Okay, so the Negev is the same place where Abraham purchased Sarah's grave. So this is an important place. Kiriath Arba, the city of Arba, that's Hebron today. So we know where that's at. Debir, the city of the book. And so this indicates that this is either a place of learning. It might have been a governmental outpost where they kept records. But then Judah defeats Sheshai, Ahiman, Talmai, and this tells us that this is the recount of an event that happens in Joshua 15, 13 through 16. And the main difference in the accounts are that Judah, the tribe, is winning the battle. In Joshua, the victory is attributed to Caleb. And it's not given to the tribe, it's given to a specific person.
Right.
So this is going to be a big deal here in a minute. Also, in Joshua 15, we find out that these three guys with the funny names are sons of Anak. And this is important because Numbers 13:33, it reads, "And we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who came from the Nephilim, and we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them." So specifically, when Judah defeats the city here in Judges, it's direct hand-to-hand combat with the Nephilim. And so, but we only get that if you put the Joshua information in and you plug the Numbers information in and you begin to get this fuller picture.
Right.
And so, but you got to remember, this was right after the report of the 12 spies, and the 12 spies, that includes Caleb.
Sure.
So, and we're getting ready to move into the story of Caleb and his importance here within the book of Judges.
Yeah. Now you mentioned earlier that Caleb was not one of the Israelites.
Right.
And so he's one of the people who was actually for going to fight.
Right.
And so
he was actually more vocal than Joshua was.
Yeah. Because I mean, and I think we talked about this earlier, where it was kind of like there's speculation that maybe he didn't have the mentality of someone coming out of captivity and was like, no, we deal with these people all the time. And,
right.
We can take care of that.
We can do this. Yeah. Well, and that's the thing. Caleb, when we talk about him, I was really surprised to learn that he's not Jewish. By birth, he's a Canaanite. And let's see if I can find my verse here. Joshua 14, Caleb approaches Joshua and says, hey, Moses promised me a specific inheritance, and I want it. And this is 45 years after Moses made the promise, and Caleb's still hanging on and saying, hey, I want what was promised to me.
Mm-hmm.
And so it specifically says in Joshua, then Joshua blessed him. He gave Hebron to Caleb, the son of Jephunneh. How you like that name? I think that should be our next child, Jephunneh, next baby born in the family. Jephunneh for an inheritance. Therefore, Hebron became the inheritance of Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, the Canaanite, to this day, because he wholly followed the Lord, the God of Israel. Now, the name of Hebron was formerly Kiriath Arba. Arba was the greatest man among the Anakim, and the land rest from war. So everything we were talking about here, kind of all tied up. There's no doubt that Caleb's a Canaanite.
Mm-hmm.
There's no doubt that they were fighting the Anakim, and like I said, with the numbers, those are the Nephilim. Now, there's been some debate because there's another genealogy in First Chronicles that mentions Caleb. It's a different Caleb. Remember, just because somebody in the Bible has the same name, it doesn't mean it's the same person.
Yeah, I know plenty of people named Bill.
Right, exactly.
So one thing too, I know there is mention in the Bible of the Anakim having 6 fingers and 6 toes, on 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, each of their feet. There we go. I like that one. And so this, what you're talking about with Judah, this battle here where they cut off the thumb and the
big toe.
Is there any kind of...
Are they trying to humanize him?
Well, that was my question. Is there any kind of indication that has anything to do with if he was among the Anakim? Did this king have 6 fingers and 6 toes, and were they just trying to make him more normal? I don't know. Question.
And honestly, I would not be surprised if I could find some kind of Jewish folklore that probably suggested the same thing.
Right.
But I don't know if we can get there from scripture. So, but it's a fun thought.
I would be curious to find out more on that. I meant to look up some more on that, but we've been preparing all week for for the visit.
Oh yeah. So, but there's that wonder that can't even talk. Those are the things that the scripture makes you wonder about.
Oh yeah.
And it's like when you start putting all the pieces in place, and you realize, hey, wait a minute, there's probably more going on here than what I realized. And more of it's explained than what we realized when we start realizing, like, just that with Caleb, we can pull together from Judges, go back to Joshua, go back to Numbers, and then we go back to Genesis, and the themes are consistent. And this is the reason why I think the Bible has to be inspired. Now, as a Canaanite, this meant that Caleb was the descendant of Jethro.
Mm-hmm.
And Jethro is the father-in-law of Moses.
Sure.
He's the one who realized that Moses was overworked and frazzled and needed a break. And he helped Moses establish the 70 judges to deal with the people's problems so that Moses could focus on the things he needed to focus on. Moses asked Jethro to, hey, come with us. We're going to be taking up residence in our new land and our new home in a couple of weeks, and we'd love to have you along.
We could build a wing for you.
Yeah. It wound up being a 40-year trek, but the Canaanites, they're treated with great affection. And what I thought was interesting is in Genesis 15, when God makes the covenant with Abraham and he says, hey, you're going to drive out the Canaanites, here we see them drop from the list after Moses and Jethro have their moment of bonding.
Right.
And so there's actually a hypothesis. Heiser did a lot of work on this in his Exodus series. It's called the Canaanite hypothesis. And it's the idea that these people, the Canaanites or the Midianites, they were actively involved in the worship of Yahweh, and that Moses learned about the worship of Yahweh from Jethro, his father-in-law, because Jethro is a priest.
Right.
And he makes a declaration. He knows that God is the one true God. Now, how much he realized that before his interaction with Moses and seeing the plagues and the parting of the Red Sea, and how much of it,
Right, because we did speculate that there were different priests back then who would just, for the right price, would contact whichever god you wanted. and it's kind of similar like a chaplain who works with many denominations or different religious backgrounds.
And that definitely occurred. Now, what I find to be interesting is if we talk about retellings, if you look at Melchizedek and you look at Jethro, they're the same story.
Okay.
And so you've got a great retelling there. And Melchizedek was the priest of the one true God, the creator of heaven and earth. He's the one who first spoke that term, creator of heaven and earth. And so when you put those together, it kind of makes me lean towards the idea that Jethro was doing the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
And he would have been, I believe, was a descendant of Esau.
Right.
And so Esau, what did he do? And we talked about in Genesis that he wasn't this big, horrible person.
Right.
He was just not the one chosen to fulfill the covenant. And while Jacob was away, he took care of the land.
Right.
And so the idea that Jethro could know the true God, the God of Abraham, it's not a stretch.
Yeah. I mean, it's reasonable to think that Melchizedek had successors.
Yeah. Yeah. And we're still piecing some of that together. And I hope that as we find more documents, more archaeological digs and things like that, we get to learn some more. But we do know that this affinity for the Canaanites, it continued. Matter of fact, at one point when Saul's going to attack, he warns, y'all guys need to get out. Before we come take over everybody else, you're going to need to get out. And that's in 1 Samuel 15. Jael, we're going to talk a lot about her. She's a Kenite. So we also, too, and I almost missed this note, that we have inscriptions in Canaan from this time period that have the name of God, the tetragrammaton, the Yod-He, Vav-He, name given at Moses, in this area.
Right.
And this was prior to the Exodus.
And that's what we would pronounce Yahweh.
Yes.
Because
yeah.
Let's make sure everyone is clear on that.
Yeah. The name, and specifically, the name given at the burning bush. And so to have that present before the Exodus, now, granted, that's if you take the later date, that's important and that's significant. And we aren't going to talk about the dating of Exodus.
We are not going to talk about the dating.
No.
No.
So, but it was there early. That's all we need to know. I think that's the significant part. And it's important also to note that these are coppersmiths. Their name Kenite is based on the word for smith.
Okay.
And so we do have, and that's important because when we get to the story of Jael, that's going to play in to their to all of her interactions.
Okay.
So anyway, so this is who Caleb is. That's the main point. Caleb is not a Judite.
Right.
He is beyond that. And he has been accepted. And he's so accepted. And this is what I love about his story. He's so accepted that even today, we don't realize that he's not Jewish.
Right.
Even today when we tell the story.
Yeah, I had never heard of that. Well, I hadn't realized it until we had gone through this study,
Well, yeah, and that's the thing. When we see this is a way to push back against, oh, well, God just kills people who are of a different race or ethnicity than his people. No, that's not what's going on.
Right.
God is taking out people who have rejected him and continue to try to stay in the land that he has claimed for his own. Mm-hmm. And even today, if you come home and like I said, come home, there's a burglar in your house. You don't say, hey, you can eat out of the fridge. Here's the remote. Shall I go run you a bath? I mean,
right,
you kick them out. So we also have, this is where the text breaks in with another nice little story. It's actually one of my favorites. It's very brief.
And this is Caleb's daughter, right?
This is Caleb's daughter.
And we've mentioned before the feminist theology in the book of Judges. This is our first little glimpse of that, where we kind of see, and again, not political so much as just studying women of the Bible.
Right.
And kind of how the Bible treats women. And again, we're going to see that women aren't just property in the Bible.
Right.
They actually have some stuff going on. Now, granted, she is sold off basically to another man, but
she becomes a prize.
So let's look at this.
Okay, so this is verse 12. And Caleb said, "He who attacks Kiriath Sefer and captures it, I will give him Achsah, my daughter, for a wife." And Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, captured it, and he was given Achsah, his wife, for a daughter. And when she came to him, she urged him to ask her father for a field. And she dismounted from the donkey, and Caleb said to her, "What do you want?" She said, "To give me a blessing. Since you have set me in the land of Negev, give me also springs of water." And Caleb gave her the upper springs and the lower springs. Okay, what I love about this is, yes, she's given as a prize. But number one, we got to go back and think about that culture.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
She was just given to the man who was a conquering war hero.
Yeah.
You want your daughters married to a man who can defend them.
Yeah.
He was making sure she had the best husband, the best provider, the best protector that he could possibly get for her. So this is the act of a loving father.
Right.
And in this time, this was not in debate. And so the second thing, she urges her husband, says, "Hey, go talk to dad and tell him this is what we want." But dad doesn't even give her a chance. He just, "What do you want?" He approaches her.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's this meeting of equals that he's not talking down to her. He's not, playing any kinds of games. She says, "Hey, I want a blessing." The JPS translates it, "I want a gift." And this is not a bride price.
Right. Well, and the other thing to take into account here is if you, as we mentioned before, and this kind of goes, possibly is not in the text because it kind of goes without saying, is the idea that the woman has the right to refuse this. So it's quite possible that this was discussed between Achsah and Caleb, that they sat down and he said, "Okay, here's the deal. We need to find you a good husband. How are we going to do it? What do you think?" And who knows? They might have just been playing around. And, well, what do you think? If we can get someone to do this, would you marry? Marry this guy?
And Othniel may have been a front runner anyway. I mean, this is Caleb's nephew, and so she's marrying her cousin here, which wasn't uncommon. Right. And so when Caleb put out the call to arms, he probably knew what was going to happen. I mean, this was a family member, so you kind of what it's like. We can pretty much guess who's going to be doing what in the family. Mm-hmm. And so when she asked for this gift, she's saying, "Hey, yeah, I know you gave my husband a pretty sweet deal, but because Othniel got to keep the city with the spoils, but I want to be remembered too." And so this would have been hers. This would not have been her husband's. This would have been distinct. And not only does he give her what she asked for, he gives her above and beyond what she asked for.
Yeah, she asked for some springs, and he says, "Well, I'll give you the springs, but I'm going to give you these springs, and give you both the springs, the upper and the lower."
Again, loving father, because now she's established and their family is set up to be wealthy and successful. And the other thing to point out, she was not an abused woman.
Right.
Abused women do not make demands like this.
Right.
So she felt confident. She's riding a donkey, by the way. That's a sign of being honored. Mm-hmm. And so she's being well cared for. And I like the story because it's just simple. It's just a simple little peek behind the scenes. And we're going to talk.
And it's actually, I mean, it's something that's kind of odd to even be put into the text. Mm-hmm. I mean, unless there's some other, I mean, I guess you could say this was probably put in there again, if you wanted to think of it, just preserving history or something like that, where to say, well, he took the city, but this is how his family got the springs too. Yeah. I mean, you could throw that in there for property rights or things like that, because we do have a lot of information about property rights in here. But that might be where it came from. But at the same time, it's still a very minor story. And you could have just assumed that, okay, he got the city and the surrounding lands.
Oh, yeah.
But so that's where.
So, yeah, but they're giving credit back to her. And this whole little event and scene here that's set up is going to come into play whenever we get to talking about the judges themselves. Mm-hmm. Because now we know who Othniel is. We have some good background on him. And he's going to be our first judge.
Yeah, so he is the Othniel that's in the
Yes,
next
he's the first
chapter.
judge. He's a Canaanite. He's not even one of the Jews. He is, but he's set up to take the stage,
Mhm.
and it's here in the scene where it begins. So that's where I'm talking about. We had just had all that stuff from Joshua and Numbers and Genesis that we were talking about,
Mhm.
and now we've got this little scene that's pushing us forward. So that's the tension that the writer's creating.
Right.
So, as we move out of this, then Judah faces its first defeat. This in verses 18 through 20, and it tells us that it's facing its first defeat because they've got iron chariots. The Hittites have iron chariots. This is an excuse, because none of the victories that Israel has accomplished so far have anything to do with their military might.
Right.
It has, Jericho, nothing they did caused those walls to fall down. And so this idea that, they couldn't win because there's chariots involved, it's ridiculous when you look at it according to everything that has happened in Joshua.
Mhm.
So God, he caused the sun to stand still. And we do know from archaeological evidence that they were using iron at this point. Now, iron was not widely used until 12 to 586 BCE, 1200 to 586 BC. But the Hittites, they were before everybody else. They're 13th century. They are at the leading edge of it. And the Egyptians controlled a lot of Canaan at this point, and they would have been using the latest military advantages that the Hittites had to offer when they weren't fighting with the Hittites.
Sure.
So, but, they're supposed to be winning. The point is Judah's supposed to be winning because God's with them.
Right.
So, verse 21, we're moving away from Judah. We're going into the tribe of Benjamin. And the tribe of Benjamin, they're living in Jerusalem. And if you notice the verse there, it says that they live with the Jebusites.
Right. They just go in and they're like, oh, these people aren't so bad.
Yeah, there's no hint of a battle. There's no actual, hey, we're even going to try anything. But they aren't supposed to be with the Jebusites. They're supposed to be with God.
Right.
And it's like, what's going on? And this is the setup for the last half of the book of Judges, because the last half of the book of Judges centers on the tribe of Benjamin and how they are consistently failing to do the right thing. It does say that until this day, they lived with the Jebusites in verse 21. Raddick, he's one of the rabbis, he said that meant that until Samuel's day when he wrote the book of Judges. So Samuel probably didn't write it, but definitely up into the monarchy that the Jebusites were still there. So,
and then the rest of that chapter is we basically just see a whole bunch of cohabitation and not doing the right thing.
A ton of it, a ton of that. And I do want to look at what's going on with Benjamin, because we got some interesting parallels that the writer has set up this is not Benjamin, it would be Joseph, the house of Joseph and going into Bethel. And so we got some interesting parallels both with what Judah accomplished in the first part of the chapter, also with Jericho and Rahab, and the writer once again creating that tension.
Mm-hmm.
So how are we on time?
You're good.
We're good. Okay.
We'll wrap this up and then we'll be about good.
We'll wrap it. Okay. So verses 22 through 26, I think we should just read that. Do you want to read that?
No, go ahead.
Okay. The house of Joseph also went up against Bethel, and the Lord was with them, and the house of Joseph scouted out Bethel. Now the name of the city was formerly Luz. And the spies saw a man coming out of the city, and they said, "Please show us the way into the city, and we will deal kindly with you." And he showed them the way into the city, and they struck the city with the edge of the sword. But they let the man and all his family go. And the man went to the land of the Hittites and built a city and called its name Luz, and it was that is its name to this day. So, all right. Real short, simple, sweet account. And on the surface, it kind of looks harmless.
Right.
But we actually have some things going on here that are just wrong. Now, first of all, anybody who's listened to our Genesis series or read your Bible, Bethel is the place where Jacob had seen the angels ascending and descending. So this is an important
site.
Yeah, very important sacred site. And it's a deliberate setup. The writer is wanting us to compare this with what happened with Judah. Remember, Judah captured Adonai Bezek. They captured the high ruling mayor of Bezek. The house of Joseph captures a nobody. He's just a random guy. He doesn't even get a name.
Right.
Who cares? Judah, they fight, pursue, they seize, they mutilate. Joseph is, hey, come help us. Please help us. Can't you make this? So, and then they offer, without the guy even negotiating or asking for, they offer to save his family. Adonai Bezek, he dies. The trader built a whole new house, a whole new town that continues to exist. And so the house of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh, it's an idiom to cover both of them.
Right.
They're falling down. They're falling down on the job. They're not doing what they're supposed to do.
Right.
And we're all supposed to read this with another story in mind, and that's Jericho.
Sure.
Which that's the opening account of Joshua, and so here in this opening account of Judges, we have Jericho. In both accounts, they send men to spy. In both accounts, the spies meet somebody, and Jericho is Rahab. Then we get this Mr. No Name here. She hides the spies. This guy says, yeah, it's that away. I mean, that's all he does is point out the city gates. He doesn't offer any kind of strategic advice. Rahab confesses her faith in God, and she deals kindly with the spies. This guy does nothing. He says nothing. She asks for her family to be spared. They offer it to him.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's also interesting too, because you have the tribe of Joseph here, or Manasseh and Ephraim. You have them making a covenant with the people, where in the other one you see Rahab making a covenant with God.
Precisely. That's what it all boils down to, because Rahab, she's the one who's making the overtures. She's the one who's saying, I want to be a part of this. The spies are not making random promises to her. And then she goes on and she marries Salmon, who becomes the mother of Boaz. And of course, Boaz and Ruth, if you've got a Christian Bible, that's going to be the story after Judges. So that's important. This guy doesn't become a part of the community. He continues on as a Hittite. He does not renounce his former associations. He actually builds a monument to them. So, Joseph is just, when you have these stories in mind, both the what Judah is doing with their capture, and then with Jericho, you realize Joseph is missing the point, and they are not doing things in a correct manner. Right. And that's the thing. When you read the story and you begin to plug it in to all the different scenarios that interplay with it, the scriptures that talk to each other, then you begin to realize this isn't just an innocent account. This is Joseph not being faithful. Right. And they're trying to take the easy way out. So, 27 through 35, like you said, that's just a list of, failure after failure after failure. And we just trying to think, is there really anything in there that we need to spend a lot of time on? Maybe verse 34. If you'll notice verse 34, after all of these people who have they've settled down with the inhabitants of Canaan, they've enslaved them. They have, they're living beside them. Everybody seems to be getting along in one big happy family, except for Dan. And it says, the Amorites pressed the people of Dan back into the hill country, for they did not allow them to come down to the plain. So the Amorites, if we remember the Amorites, they're in Genesis 15. And when God tells Abraham, hey, your people, your family, they're going to be oppressed for 300 years because the sins of the Amorites are not yet complete. Right. And so the Amorites are not content to let the Israelites live alongside them. And what's the most disturbing about that is verse 35. The Amorites persisted in dwelling in Mount Heres, in Aijalon, and in Shalbim, but the hand of the house of Joseph rested heavily on them, the Amorites, and they became subject to forced labor. So the house of Joseph, not only did they have this great big debacle with their spies, they aren't even helping their brother.
Right.
And so we're seeing this disintegration of the moral, ethical, and the compassion, all these aspects of relationship that were being built among the tribes as they moved under Joshua to take over this land. Now, as they're getting settled, and we're moving away from that generation who traveled in the desert and been even born in the desert. Now we're seeing them really adopt the mindset of the Canaanites.
Right.
And it just, man, it becomes a problem. And, you have to ask yourself, too, that they were told to drive these people out.
Right.
And they didn't do it. And there's this idea, well, maybe it was because they didn't have enough power. Maybe they weren't, they didn't have large enough armies. They didn't have enough military advancement.
But that's never how the battles work.
Never. And the other thing is they enslave the people. What takes more effort? What's harder, to drive people out, to conquer them completely, or to enslave them? And I would think enslaving a nation or enslaving a tribe or even just this family would take a lot more power and a lot more might than just to get rid of someone.
Right.
So I think to say that they're enslaving these people actually shows us that this is not just an act of, I couldn't, but an act of rebellion.
Sure. That makes sense. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, well, cool. Was there anything more on that, or was that kind of wrap up that point?
I think that's going to wrap up chapter 1 for us.
Okay, cool. Well, let's go ahead and stop there. That's a good place to stop, right at the end of the chapter.
Yeah.
So, everyone out there, thanks for joining us. We hope you enjoyed it. We had a good time. I had a good time. Do you have a good time?
Sure.
Okay, excellent.
I'm choked up about it.
Well, if you out there enjoyed it, be sure to like, comment, and share. If you want to help other people find us, be sure to give us a rating or a review on wherever you listen to your podcast. That gets a little higher in the ranks. Thanks for joining us. And if you want to be part of the conversation, hit us up on ravencreeksc.com, where you can find our show. You can also find, got a new show launching soon, and I'll talk more about that later, probably next week. Or it's actually kind of mostly launched. We're just waiting for iTunes approval. Anyway, but if you have been following us on Facebook, you know mostly about that. But anyway, I'm rambling now. So, speaking of Facebook, Raven Creek SC on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Join us in the conversation. Or if you have any questions, comments, or complaints, feel free to send them our way. So, anyway, thanks for joining us. Bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to the Faith and Other Oddities podcast, a Raven Creek Social Club production. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. If you like what you've heard, please write us a review on iTunes or consider supporting us on patreon.com/RavenCreekSC. As always, thank you for listening, and don't forget to join us next week.